there is, I think, an entire social group which constitutes the ruling class, which we never talk about, but which I think the existence of this group explains so much about the nature of politics today, about why people, and it's a hugely intolerant group. It is, it wants to determine what we all think. It wants to determine what we see and hear, and it wants to take our money.
On British thought leaders, filmmaker Martin Durkin says there's an enormous but faceless class of people ruling Britain.
You don't vote them into power and you can't vote them out of power, but they have immense power. They have absolutely immense power.
He says we're in an intellectual battle to understand who this elite really is.
What's often described as a culture war at the moment, between the ignorant masses and the enlightened woke elite, is a class war. But we haven't articulated that properly. We haven't understood the nature of the battle properly.
Martin talks about clear comparisons between the modern left and fascism.
The modern left say, look at these far-right people, Charlie Kirk, or they're going on about free speech, Nazis. Since when did the Nazis champion free speech? What the Nazis did, if you weren't thinking the right things or saying the things, they sent the Gestapo around to have a word with you. Yeah. Well, I wake up this morning to find the story of some character who's tweeted that he didn't like everyone hanging out Palestinian flags all over the place. 3 o'clock in the morning, the police visit him.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with filmmaker Martin Durkin. Martin, great to have you back.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
And many of our viewers will know you from Climate the Movie. Last time you were here, you said you were going to focus on this new ruling class. And before we dive into that, I want to just ask you, how free do you think we are as a society at the moment? Do you think we're on the road to some form of totalitarianism?
I think we're very dangerously on that road. Twitter is full of stuff about digital IDs and the power of supranational bodies like the EU and so on and so forth. Obviously, there are contrary movements. It was very encouraging to see all the people march on the Tommy Robinson march, and you got Elon Musk and Donald Trump over there. But notwithstanding that, I think in Britain, certainly, and in Europe, there are really worrying trends towards that. In the pandemic, we saw the adoption of a lot of techniques that you previously only saw in communist China. I went to Waitrose the other day. There was a facial recognition system as you're going into Waitrose. Yeah. And the current Labour government is insisting on digital IDs. This is a terrifying drift. Combined with other things, I don't think that's the only. I think there are other aspects to it too, but I think it is really scary, and it's being driven by the left. It's being driven by people who describe themselves as the left. I'm sure we'll come on to what left means and what right means, because there's been such a, that's so topsy-turvy now.
Yeah, I'd love to get into that, because it's definitely not how it used to be in the 70s. You got the left and you got the right. It's all quite confusing now, almost like those categories don't quite exist anymore.
I think it was always nonsense, but I think it's become increasingly nonsense. It started, for me, the bricks started crumbling in that wall in the late 90s when I made a documentary series for Channel 4 about environmentalism. And I started reading then into environmentalist writings, and they were against progress. They were against progress in the third world. I don't call it the developing world because they don't really want it to develop. They want degrowth. They think we're all paid too much. We all consume too much. I was thinking, what is left-wing radical about this? Time was that the left were saying, we're going to outdo capitalism by building bigger factories and producing more goods, and the people are going to be better off. And then, of course, when that doesn't work out, and the Soviet Union wasn't better than capitalism at producing goods, oddly enough. They seamlessly, in fact they didn't change right from the start really. Socialists were complaining that capitalism was producing too much, and they were nervous that people were becoming too affluent. That really came to the fore with environmentalism, and they really started saying, we are against this. And I was thinking, what is left wing, what is pro-working class about this? And I think it's been since then really, the last 25 years has been a sort of intellectual voyage of discovery for me, realizing that socialism is actually anti-working class, the left is anti-working class, the left is anti-progress. And the left are really what we used to consider the right, what used to be talked of as the right. You know, the National Socialism we think of as the far right. That's what everyone's bandying about today.
Yeah, everyone's
marching. You're on the far right. Yeah. No, but actually, if you look at National Socialism, it's almost identical to the left today in its economic policies and its environmentalism. It's or massive checklist you can go through. The far right is the far left, if you will.
I mean, getting into this, who the new ruling class are. I mean, everyone knows the new world order, the deep state. We've heard about things like that. But you're saying this new ruling class is something that's much harder to define and is a lot bigger than that. I mean, your YouTube channel, Guerrilla Science, for me, has the best explainers on this that I've seen. Can you talk to us about who this new ruling class are and where they came from?
Yes, the problem I've always had with saying, you know, it's the WEF, or it's Bill Gates, or it's Soros, or something like that. I was thinking, you know, if only the enemy was that small, if only there were a clutch of sort of Bond-baddie individuals and a small group of organisations, the Fabians, but it's actually bigger than that. I mean, those groups, don't get me wrong, are certainly in the mix, but the problem is much, much bigger. And I realised that. Again, this has been something of a slow realization for me, that there was an entire social class that we always ignore. And it occurred to me, actually, when I was on a Green demo, not as a participant, but sort of visiting, because I was making a doc series about the Greens. And I thought, who are these people? You know, to what social class do they belong? I was a Marxist back then, so I used to think about class all the time. And I thought, well, they're not working class. There were no workers on this rally. You didn't get any stevedores or miners or dockers or truckers or hairdressers. They weren't there. So I thought, well, maybe they're middle class. And I said, well, the middle class, the commercial middle class wasn't there. You didn't get any used car dealers or builders merchants or bank managers. You know, the hard-working commercial capitalistic middle class wasn't there. What's the name of this other group? And there is a name. It's called the New Class, and it's been used by Irving Kristol, and Popper, I think, coined it. But you know, other people use it. But you know, no one's heard of it. And yet, it's a brilliant description of that class of people who encouraged the growth of the state and have benefited from the growth of the state, and whose number has expanded with the growth of the state. And it is broadly consistent with what the Europeans call the Intelligentsia. Right. They are people who have, with university degrees, usually with arts degrees or in social sciences, not useful subjects, who are a bit snooty about capitalism and who can imagine themselves working in the public sector or for an NGO or for a charity or one of these non-commercial organizations. They are huge now. We're talking about the educational establishment, teachers and lecturers and universities, but the number of people now who are reliant on the state, who believe in a bigger state, more state power, that class is now very big, and it actually constitutes the ruling establishment. I mean, they are the senior civil servants who will talk about policy. They are the journalists, or journalists apart from some of us, are very much part of that.
These quangos.
Part of that group. Well, quangos, because they're not just directly employed by the public sector, they're also part of the intelligentsia. The intelligentsia in the West is profoundly anti-capitalist. It's profoundly socialist. But it's not socialist in the sense that it's for the working class. It's socialist in the sense that it's for a big state. It approves of the big state. It's rather, there's a profound subjective anti-capitalism from this class, which dates back to the 19th century and before. Ludwig von Mises wrote a brilliant book on it called The Anti-Capitalistic Mentality. You know, the intellectuals hate the market because the market hates them. You know, it doesn't reward them in a way that they feel that they deserve. And if you've done your English degree and then you go and you work in the media, you've got to pander to the ratings and all that kind of thing, rather than just do long documentaries about whatever your PhD was in, which is what really they want to do. But anyway, I'm running away with myself. But there is, I think, an entire social group which constitutes the ruling class, which we never talk about. but which I think the existence of this group explains so much about the nature of politics today, about why people, and it's a hugely intolerant group. It is, it wants to determine what we all think. It wants to determine what we see and hear, and it wants to take our money. It loves high taxes.
How important was the growing size of the state and the growing powers of the state in providing the kind of power base for these people?
Well, it kicked off in the modern era. I mean, you can trace the history of this class right back through history. They were the clerisy, they were the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, they were the scribes in ancient Egypt. This class that has always sort of sat beside the warrior class historically, sucking up our money, writing our laws, telling us, they were the priests as well, telling us how the universe worked and justifying the power of the kings and pharaohs and so on. There's a long history to them, but in the modern era, really the big boost to them came with the First World War, right. Because the First World War was the first total war where governments, even liberal governments like the British and American, took full control of their economies. They said they would determine output, they would determine prices, they would determine what was produced and who would produce it. Individual companies were then in wartime thought of as industries. What's iron output, what's rubber output, whatever the rest of it, and that wartime planning was a model for socialism. There was already, the socialist intellectuals were already saying, we need society to be guided by us, not by, democracy was threatening. We needed an elite of impartial experts who were going to, the guardians, Plato's guardians, that were going to run society. You can see this in the writings of H.G. Wells and the Fabians and all of that lot. But the First World War kind of delivered it. Here you have jobs for the boys, for the intellectuals, because suddenly they had, where they couldn't get jobs in the market, there were jobs in administration, which suited them down to the ground. And so with the First World War, there was a big expansion of the state. It retreated slightly with the end of the First World War, but it grew and grew, and with the Second World War, grew again. And as this spending grew, as the state assumed ever more power over our lives, to look after us, to look after our health, to look after our education, to look after our housing, to look after the railways, to look after coal, to look at so on and so forth, then the numbers of administrators grew. The amount of money going into universities grew. And J.K. Galbraith celebrated this, and I think it was in his New Industrial Society. He was saying, a new class has emerged. He uses the term new class. Has emerged in the West of administrators, and they're the real elite. They're the people who are, the shining hope for the future. They're going to organize society. This chaos of capitalism will be ordered and organized and become fair and just and secure and all the rest of it. And so, by the end of the Second World War, I think that group were becoming increasingly conscious of their own interests, and their number was huge. The size of the civil service, the increasing size of quangos, the ministries and various other sort of secondary and the third sector, the secondary organizations, the state grew and grew.
It's quite concerning because there's not really any way to hold them accountable, because there's no leader, they're not elected or anything like that, but they have all this power.
You don't vote them into power and you can't vote them out of power, but they have immense power. They have absolutely immense power. They are the Intelligentsia controls, they're the people who control publishing houses and art galleries and newspapers. Even when newspapers are privately owned, so many of those journalists have a particular, Hayek talked about this, have a particular skew towards socialism that really, that's the colour that sort of infuses an awful lot of. I was talking to an editor of the Daily Telegraph who was complaining that you couldn't get journalists who weren't left wing. So if you've got a newspaper that's trying not to be, it was really hard because as a class, these people, this is the politics that infuses the entire class. And as you say, they've got a hard power and a soft power. Hard power in the sense that the state has an awful lot of money and an awful lot of power to make laws, and so it can large corporations need to suck up to it a bit because they want big contracts, they don't want to be punished by regulation and so on, all the crony capitalist aspect. And obviously they have the powers to make laws. They can have rent controls, they can have bills that stop you saying the wrong thing in pubs. They can but there's also the soft power. They control the schools. They are the teachers. They are the university lecturers. So there is an immense amount of sway that they have in that regard. In schools today on climate, which is one of my favourite topics. You can see the bias in school teaching in that respect. They lead their pupils out on climate marches, like the Hitler Youth. So that soft power is enormous. What does any politician do to attack that class? I mean, they want the votes of the teachers and the entire public sector. They want they want the support of journalists. They're scared of being attacked by the BBC. And when they're in power, if they're trying to write a law, they're surrounded by civil servants, all of whom, are socialistic. And that power is extraordinary. I was at a birthday party for my sister, she's I shouldn't say that, but all her friends are senior civil servants, and one of them came up to me and said, and slightly shocked, saying, "I heard a rumour that you vote Tory." And I didn't want to say, actually, love, I vote Reform. There'd be absolute meltdown. But in those circles, it is, the uniformity of ideology is absolutely extraordinary. So how do you, if you're a politician and you're trying to, buck against that, you're surrounded. The people who are actually supposed to carry through your wishes are against you. If Reform got elected at the next election in the UK, I mean, they are going to have a monumental fight on their hands. Yeah. I mean, the Tories weren't particularly. I mean, the Tories are effectively a socialist party, as far as I can see. But even they, found that they were, were surrounded by enemies when they were in amongst the civil service. So yeah, they have an enormous amount of power, and you can't vote them out. We didn't vote the civil service in. You can't vote the civil service out.
Yeah, I mean, James Price was on and he talked about when the election happened, 200 people lost their jobs and were replaced. Tens of thousands remain the same, all the civil service, or the Blob as people call them. Yeah. Well, we can't do anything about that, really.
No, I mean, the only thing, it's got to be so radical. I've either got to have Javier Milei who says, right, I'm cutting public spending by a third. It would have been lovely if he cuts public spending by 2/3, but nevertheless, it was still shock, horror. He's cut public spending by a third. When you see how big public spending is, actually that's no great shakes, but nevertheless, any cut in public spending, they squeal like banshees. But either that, or of course the country goes bust, which there is a great possibility now that a lot of Western governments are headed in that direction. The French, the British. I mean, the American, economy is doing very well, but look at the level of government debt there. That's absolutely shocking. Because the thing about the Blob, the thing about the new class, is they're absolutely ravenous. They want to tax and tax and tax. And you can wave as many Laffer curves as you like at them, but they just want to tax and tax and tax. And when, you start to get opposition for it, Starmer's doing it at the moment, terribly unpopular, but then Burnham crops up in Manchester saying, I'll take over, because we need to tax some more. Yeah. We need to tax, and we need to borrow some more, and we need to spend and spend. They're like crazed animals. There is no stopping them. And you can tell, you can shout till you're blue to the face and say, look at the level of national debt. If you factor in public sector pensions, it is staggering. This cannot be sustained. The markets are going to stop. People will stop lending you money. You will go bust. They don't care. They're vampiric in their insatiability. And even when you say, look, you raise tax rates, the actual tax take will go down. They don't care. They're like, I'm going to try anyway. They're that maniac about it. The idea that we're governed by the grown-ups. Oh my goodness, that term they use, the grown-ups. The grown-ups are in charge. Look at what the grown-ups have done. Look at the levels of public debt in the UK and across the West. I mean, the grown-ups are madmen. The grown-ups are voracious bloodsuckers, really.
As you say, winning the election is one thing, but actually fixing this is a completely different ballgame, right?
Yeah, I mean, who knows what reform will be like when they get in. I mean, I hope they will be really, really radical, more radical than Donald Trump. Donald Trump has upset the blob by being who he is, and to an extent doing what he's done. But he hasn't massively cut public spending. I mean, I think that really we're getting to the point where you need to take absolutely radical steps. You've got to privatise the NHS. You've got to privatise schools. You've got to privatise the education system. You've got to stop giving any money whatsoever to the universities. You know, they must be private institutions. I mean, it's nothing short of a social revolution that needs to take place to get us back on track, to get us back to a properly speaking, free market, civilized society, as we were in the late Victorian, early 20th century.
You talked about the intelligentsia. What role did that shift to the left play, and why is it still kind of playing now, really?
Well, they've always been on the left in the sense that they've always hated capitalism. In the 19th century, the old gentry were very, terribly snooty about trade and the new kind of industrial forces in Britain. Most industrial pioneers came from the working classes. Samuel Smiles, I've just done a film about this. Samuel Smiles' great book, Self-Help, in the middle of the 19th century, just looking at all the industrial pioneers. They're all from dirt poor backgrounds, and this was true of the States as well. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Ford, they were all from poor backgrounds. And it was considered a great kind of social upset. The social mobility that was happening in Victorian England was very upsetting. And one mark of the kind of declining gentry, one thing that distinguished them was education. Right. You could have new money. They might have money to spend on silk top hats in Bradford, but they didn't have accents. They didn't have culture. They didn't have that thing. And so one big thing as a mark of social distinction was education. That they would absolutely do anything to get their children into a good school with a good accent. But there was also a real snobbery when it came to what they were going to study. You should not study anything practical. It's got to be classics. It's got to be history. It's got to be something along those lines. That would be the kind of distinguishing mark. And there's lots have been written about this. But the upshot is this molds our education system enormously. I mean, in schools today, still, they'll teach you. Everyone does English literature. They're as if really what we really need is literary critics, but they won't teach you. How many kids study engineering, or how to get a mortgage, or how to balance the books, or how to start a company, or all sorts of skills that you actually need in the real world? But you can do Latin, and you can do ancient history, and you can do blah, 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 blah. And that's still, from that world. The intelligentsia, it's a mark almost of status among intellectuals, the distance you are from the market in terms of the thing you study. So if you're studying hotel management, or that's awful. But if you're studying the classics, or if you're about French poetry or something like that, you have more kudos in intellectual circles. But when you leave university, of course, what are you going to do with your degree, or your PhD in Baudelaire, or your degree in anthropology and African tribes? No one wants you. This sort of adds fuel to the fire of this visceral anti-capitalism of the intellectuals. But that anti-capitalism is not pro-worker. One thing we really need to cut is the notion that socialism means pro-working class. It absolutely does not. Socialism means pro a big state. It means pro-spending on university-educated people who are going to run that state. The state has its own set of interests.
You see socialist marches, and you don't really see many worker types on them.
None. And also you see how they vote. I mean, the Reform and the Tories combined, if you look at voting intentions, they've got they're 3 times as much working class support as Labour. 3 times as much working class support for the Tories and Reform combined as for Labour. The Labour Party is not a working class party. The Labour Party is the party of the intelligentsia, the public sector, and people who are sadly on welfare and who are scared of the taps being turned off. That's broadly speaking what the Labour Party is. And sometimes immigrants who want to get their families in and want to keep an open door policy. That's pretty much what the Labour Party is. They are not a working class party. I wouldn't go into the history of the Labour and the trade unions, but there was always conflict there. There was always snobbery from the socialist intellectuals in the past on trade union consciousness, is what they called it. That's all gone. In America, likewise, among white blue collar workers in America, more than twice as many vote Republican as vote Democrat. They've lost the working class vote, absolutely, and for good reason. For good reason, because their policies are anti-working class. Net zero is completely anti-working class. You know, the working class hold them in complete disdain, and they know that green, especially modern green socialism, is thoroughly against them. There's a snobbery running all the way through it, and they can smell it. You know, when Labour politicians look at St George's flags outside houses where there's a white van parked in there, they loathe the working class. And you can see from the march that, you know, that really that ordinary working class people are essentially Thatcherite in their perspective on life. You know, they believe in hard work, saving, you know, looking after your family, strong community, pretty traditional values of sort of tolerance and good sense of humour. You know, England as it was, yeah, pretty much, and that's held in scorn. All of that is held in scorn by the left.
We see attacks from the left on capitalism and saying it kind of made the workers poorer. But if we look at history, it brought the workers up, didn't it? It obviously made the business owners richer, but it brought the workers up as well.
Oh, I mean, it was absolutely spectacular. I mean, it was. This is utter nonsense from the left. Marx argued that the division of labour would make workers poorer because it de-skilled the workers. You know, if you cut up a complex task into a lot of simpler tasks, which need less skill to do, then less skill will be needed. The workers will not be able to maintain the same wages. Likewise, the introduction of machinery, they would make workers unemployed. The competition for jobs would become higher, and workers would get poorer. The capitalism, the division of labour, and the introduction of machines would make workers poorer. That's absolutely central to what Marxism is and what socialism has meant, and it was all absolute nonsense. If you look at the division of labour, it vastly produces the amount of goods being produced. I did a film on this recently where we looked at pencils. You know, how you make a pencil. You know, the division of labour is such that not just within a factory, but between factories. So you've got graphite being mined over there, you've got wood being grown in a forest over there, you've got rubber for your end being, you know, grown in another country, all being processed in different factories, the glue to put them all together in a different factory, the paint that goes on the outside factory, loads of different processes in order to go to make a pencil. Are these people de-skilled that do these things? I mean, absolutely not. You've got to be skilled in making machines and mending machines and developing new machines and transportation, and all sorts of different skills are needed. And the idea that this makes us poorer is I mean, obviously completely nonsense. It didn't happen. In industrial countries, workers got richer and richer and richer. The richest workers in the world were the workers in the industrial capitalist nations that were most ferociously capitalistic, in Britain and America. That's where wages were higher. Within those countries, wages were highest in industrial areas. You know, which is why workers wanted to go there and do those jobs. It clearly made them richer. And the notion that this Marxist notion that we're not rewarded for our day's work. You know, we put in a good day's work, but we only rewarded for part of it, and the rest of it is profit that this greedy, you know, monster capitalist sort of takes from us. Total nonsense. There's a brilliant political economist, Bastiat, who talked about this before Marx was writing Capital, and he was saying the amazing thing about the division of labour and capitalism is how much it showers on us, so much more than we could ourselves produce. So, and he gives the example, you know, you wake up in the morning, you're on a bed, you've got, I'll use a modern example, you've got duvet, you've got pillows, you've got floorboards, you've got, you know, the alarm clock, you go into the bathroom, you've got all the plumbing, you've got the porcelain sinks, you've got the loo, you've got the shaving equipment, you've got all the stuff, all the lights, the electric lights, the grids. You go out, you have breakfast of orange juice and muesli and coffee and tea, and you get into your car, and what do you do? And you go out, and there are pavements, and there are lights, and there's air conditioning, and offices, and cinemas, and restaurants, and all this stuff. What do you do for this? You might work in a flower shop. You know, you might sell a bit of life insurance. You might do, but there is, what's incredible about capitalism is the disproportion between what you're able to do yourself and the goods to which you have access to and consume. You know, how hard is it to make a television? We take television so bloody hard making a television. You can never make a television. So the idea that we're being ripped off is so ridiculous. You know, this is a system that has showered on ordinary people a greater amount of prosperity. I mean, no one with any sense of history can be anything but amazed at what capitalism has done. But you still read, I get comments on the little films we do in Guerrilla Science. People say, but you know, there's workers today are not as well off as, you know, people were in the Middle Ages. You know, do you not know anything about the Middle Ages?
They only had iPhone 1 then. We've got 15 now.
I mean, you know, the idiocy. But yeah, the notion that capitalism has made us poorer is obviously complete nonsense. But they stopped claiming that. If you read green literature today, they're complaining that capitalism's enriched the masses too much. They are always complaining about consumption, the consumer society. We are consuming too much. Gaia won't cope with it. We are consuming too much. But what they mean is that ordinary people are consuming too much. They don't
like
mean
a
they're
snobbery?
consuming too much.
Is it?
Utter snobbery.
Right.
Utter snobbery. Because it's mass production that they hate. It's the mass production of, you know, cheap shampoo. They love the kind of posh shampoo that they have in the sort of rather beautifully designed sort of bottles. They love their fancy cheese shops up in Highbury. You know, they love the shops that they go to. They love going to the, you know, get Italian floor tiles and, you know, the right kind of paint from just the right kind of sort of sellers, all that sort of stuff. It's the gaudy mass consumption which so offends them. It's the prosperity of the masses that really upsets modern green socialists. And it's absolutely evident when you read their books. Earth First, I was thinking poetically, went to a shopping mall and had a puke in. They all went around being sick.
Really?
Working class consumption upsets them. Middle class consumption, not. It is sheer snobbery. Environmentalism is snob anti-capitalism. It's posh anti-capitalism. We've got to understand that posh people have always hated capitalism. That's part of the confusion with the far left, far right thing. The Nazis were supported by the civil service, by teachers, by aristocrats, by posh people. They couldn't get the support of working class people at all. They didn't want the support of working class. They were always really rude about working classes. But they were also socialist. They absolutely were socialist. It's not true that they weren't socialist. This thing about the National Socialists was just some sort of accident that they, you know, got the spelling wrong and it accidentally ended up in the name. They were definitely socialists. Socialists are not pro-working class.
Did these people, this new class back in the 20th century, have some role in the problems we had with fascism and communism, would you say?
They absolutely created both fascism and communism. I mean, there's a brilliant book, Grunberger, on the social history of the Third Reich, and one of the great two driving thrusts really behind the National Socialist movement. There's another great book, George Moss, The Ideological Origins of the Third Reich. Germany had involved a massive expansion of the public sector. It was a military bureaucratic society up to the 19th century. And then the 19th century, you know, they're defeated at the Battle of Jena, serfdom collapses. It doesn't properly collapse till the middle of the 19th century in Germany. There's a real shock of capitalism arriving in Germany. And the old classes, the bureaucratic class, the new class, if you will, was in a state of disarray and distress over this. The bile of Nietzsche really sort of expresses the kind of upset that they had, that the serfs had left the land and were going to the cities and working for Jewish department stores and all that kind of thing. With the war, one huge problem for that class is that it bankrupted Germany. And so this vast civil service that they had were out of work. And that provided the real fertile basis for the growth of fascism. The universities and the civil service and the education, public education, were the real power base for the Nazis. I mean, in the 1930s, among Prussian civil servants, only 1 in 5 were not members of the National Socialist Party. And among students, something like 77% of students voted to have Jews excluded from student bodies in Germany in the 1930s. And that was among in universities, there was proportionally there was twice the amount of support for the Nazis as the rest of the general population. Really? So that was the class really that brought National Socialism into being. And indeed, if you look at the eugenics movement in Britain and America, in Britain it was the socialists. It was H.G. Wells, it was John Maynard Keynes, it was George Bernard Shaw. It was those socialists who were terribly keen on eugenics. I mean, they were talking about literally killing killing people, killing lower-class people, lumpen proletarians. D.H. Lawrence, who wanted the redistribution of wealth, he was a socialist, imagined leading them all into Crystal Palace and filling it with gas in order to kill them. And this was, and some of this was being written. H.G. Wells wrote his book with Julian Huxley on the Science of Life, big eugenics tract, after it was known that the Nazis were killing mentally disabled people in Germany. So, the Nazis weren't alone. And the class from which all this stuff was coming from was really the socialist intelligentsia, and likewise communism. Very similar people like both the fascists and the communists in the 1920s, 1930s in the West.
When we have people now calling others Nazis, it doesn't really, if they look back at the history, it's actually kind of the opposite of what they think almost.
I think if you look at realistically, the National Socialist movement, it's almost in the main thrust of its, in various areas, in its economics, in its environmentalism, they were they more or less invented environmentalism. In so many areas, it's almost indistinguishable from the modern left today. The modern left say, look at these far-right people, Charlie Kirk, they're going on about free speech, Nazis. Since when did the Nazis champion free speech? What the Nazis did, if you weren't thinking the right things or saying the things, they sent the Gestapo around to have a word with you. Yeah. Well, I wake up this morning to find the story of some character who's tweeted that he didn't like everyone hanging out Palestinian flags all over the place. 3 o'clock in the morning, the police visit him. His wife's blinking in stage 4 cancer, and he's getting calls at 3 o'clock in the morning from coppers because he said something rude about Palestinian flags. Likewise, if you're on the civil service and you say, by the way, I vote reform, look out. You will face social ostracism. You can forget your next. If you're in a university and you say that you think this climate chaos stuff is a load of cack, then you will be ostracized, you will be in trouble, the students will turn against you, your fellow academics will turn against you. This is far closer to what the National Socialists were doing in the 1930s, which was saying there are certain views which are simply unacceptable. And it starts all tender, but then, it gets tougher, as Lucy Connolly discovered when she had spent 30 months in prison. The notion that the free speech people are the Nazis, this is entirely topsy-turvy. And this leftist idea today that, of course, the National Socialists weren't really socialists. We talked about this, it was in the title. Am I allowed to, I brought some quotes.
Please do.
I brought some quotes. I'm sorry, you'll have to kind of edit out the pause as I'm looking for them. But I think it's really, it just occurred to me this morning, because unlike lots of people, I've actually read Mein Kampf, and I've read Hitler's, Talking with Hitler and various other kind of original works, and likewise Mussolini. They really were socialists. Here's some quote. We are not fighting Jewish or Christian capitalism, we are fighting every capitalism. We are making the people completely free. That was Hitler. We demand the nationalization of all public companies, in other words, socialization, or what is known here as socialism. The basic principle of the party's economic program should be made perfectly clear that the blah, blah, blah. The bourgeoisie is rotten to the core. It has no ideals anymore. All it wants is to earn money. Hitler. They were, properly speaking, socialists. John Maynard Keynes is the god of today's socialists. Yeah, he wants more public spending, wants more control over the economy, wants higher taxes. John Maynard Keynes adored the National Socialists. He used to have lunch regularly with Oswald Mosley. He advised Mosley on Mosley's economic policy. Oswald Mosley, leader of the British fascists, was a Labour MP. He'd been in a Labour government. These people were socialists. The socialists have wanted this, a massive state all along. The Nazis had a name for the adoration of the state, a quasi-religious belief in and love of the state. Well, what's the Labour Party? Public service. All this kind of thing. They love the state. They don't give a damn about it. You say to them, but working class people, their standard of living being decimated. Working class people in London can't go around following trades because you blocked off all the roads. Look at the heating bills of working class people. It's going through the roof. You print money, you just make working class people poorer because they can't afford food anymore. They don't give a damn. They don't give a damn. They're not for the working class, and the working class isn't for them. The Nazis were socialists, and in every respect, I mean, I'm trying to think of any way in which the National Socialists differ from modern socialists. I know socialists will say, well, we don't believe in gassing Jews, but my God, they're anti-Semitic. They are profoundly anti-Semitic. And in the minds of a lot of socialists today, they still link capitalism with Jewishness. And socialists of the 1930s and 20s, they were eugenicists. They weren't against killing off people. So, you know, and H.G. Wells, he describes the need to kill people, literally the need to kill Untermenschen, the lower orders who are not socially acceptable. There's a great clip that's often played on Twitter from George Bernard Shaw saying the same thing. We've got to kill people who are just, you know, useless people.
You see people, well-meaning people, blaming things on big tech or big oil or billionaires not paying enough taxes. Do you think it's just that people don't have the right knowledge about how the left works and the left's kind of playbook?
I think there's a big problem that we haven't, because the left is the intelligentsia. They write the books about this stuff. They write the books about class. So they've written themselves out of the picture in terms of being a sort of wicked ruling class. I think we haven't had the kind of intellectual framework. That's one problem. There's a lot of what's often described as a culture war at the moment, you know, between the ignorant masses and the enlightened woke elite, is a class war. But we haven't articulated that properly. We haven't understood the nature of the battle properly. We haven't understood that there's an actual ruling class here that we are opposed to and that we need to oppose. I think one really important thing is to turn what is at the moment a kind of fairly intuitive, inarticulate battle. We need to tool up intellectually. We need to understand what the nature of the battle is. We need to explain to people the need to fight it and the nature of the fight, and to reduce the fight to memorable slogans so that we don't get misdirected into thinking, oh, maybe it's tax evaders that's responsible for whatever else. So that's, I think, the battle that we have. It's an intellectual battle in a way to define the nature of the struggle.
So you were, in your younger days, part of the kind of radical left. Do you think that's giving you insight into these things to understand the nature of the problem more?
I think it sort of has helped, because I think in a sane world, you don't sit down and read loads of Marx and Lenin and Trotsky and Lukács and Matic and all these sort of Marxist tracts on economics and so on and so forth. So I think that the slight lunacy I had in those days, being on the far left, actually made me do that. And so, yeah, it makes me a lot less. I think sometimes when I meet libertarians who are still grappling with the arguments of the left, if you've lived it, it's quite useful in a way, because you know yourself what the weak points are, because you know yourself when you were making those arguments the areas that made you feel uncomfortable and you thought you couldn't support. So in a sense, coming from the left is quite and I think a lot of the most enthusiastic libertarian thinkers have come from the left. You know, Thomas Sowell, you know, Janet Daly, all sorts of people have sort of gone through that experience before coming out of the other end.
As for me, this is what you have on guerrilla science that maybe some others don't have, a clear understanding of what the left has done in the history and how to find that in the modern problems.
I think reading more history is really, really important. I think reading around, and also reading your enemies. I mean, one thing that I've set out to do when I was having to make documentaries about things are really useful, because it means you've got to talk to them and interview them and read their stuff, and that's really useful. Because sometimes I say that, you know, the thing is with the Green Movement, they want working class people to be poorer. And people say, no, surely. And I say, read their books. Read their books. It's in there. It's in there. And actually, it is so enlightening reading what these people read. It's more shocking than you can possibly imagine. But I think it's really important for us. As I say, we need to kind of do a bit of intellectual tooling up for the struggle ahead. At the beginning, you said, you know, are we drifting towards authoritarianism? I think that's true, but I also think, not least thanks to X and other things, and you know, your show and other outlets like this, I think that there is also a really exciting development, which is, I think people are talking and thinking much more imaginatively about what the nature of the problems are that we're facing, and what to do about them. So I think there's an encouraging kind of growth of intellectual inquiry, if you will, into a different kind of radicalism. We're used to thinking of socialism as radicalism. We've got to ditch that. So the socialists, they're now in charge.
Martin Durkin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.